where you can submit your questions that will go to the panelists today, and please do so at your leisure. Three important announcements. One is please turn off your cell phones. That would be greatly appreciated by everybody. The second is Really? I can't see what it says there, so you can have a good joke on me. The second is that this, as Marie was saying, this is not about actually winners or losers in this debate, and we would like you to actually observe some decorum during the debate. Please do not give applause. Please, no cat calls. I like this side, I like that side, because it will just take time away from the very short time that we have to explore all of these issues. Finally, what we would like to do when the session is done, we have to vacate this stage at 6:15 for the MIT orchestra. So therefore, we are asking the panelists will actually be exiting the stage before we ask you to leave, and everyone is going to meet in the lobby where there will be food and beverage, and you'll have plenty of time to talk with all the panelists. So I would appreciate it if you could do that. This debate today comes at an auspicious time because humanity is at a crossroads without a precedent in our history. Because of the extraordinary and exponential growth of population and of the technological economic system, especially since the mid-20th century, humans have become pervasive and dominant forces in the health and well-being of the earth and its inhabitants. This is manifest in many ways, but most starkly in the destabilization of the Earth's climate, to the point that if continued, will foreclose options for human progress we all strive for. Some have called it an existential crisis. Human progress has accelerated in the last 10,000 years during a time of relatively stable climate. According to the archaeological and ice records, the longest period of climate stability in human history. If that weren't the case, we would not have a modern society. We would not have agriculture. We would not be able to live in one place. This is happening because of the failure of the market economy to fully account for many of the negative human and environmental impacts that are imposed on society and the life support system. There are many ways to correct market failures, some of which we are very familiar with: regulation, taxes and tax incentives, institutional and individual purchasing. Today, the debate will focus on one specific piece of a strategy to deal with the climate crisis. Whether, and if so, how to use MIT's participation in the ownership and investment in the market, in market-based institutions, to move society on a sustainable path. It's important to note that the debate will not focus on whether the climate is changing, that human activity, mostly through the use of fossil fuels, is a major cause, and deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are urgently needed. The IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, the National Academy of Science, the dozens of scientific bodies, and most of the world's government agree that we need to move as quickly as possible. It is fitting that this debate is occurring at one of the most respected universities in the world. Without higher education, there would be no modern society. Higher education has been granted tax-free status, the ability to receive public and private funds, and academic freedom in exchange for educating students and producing the knowledge that will result in a thriving civil society. The best and most credible research on climate disruption and effective solutions comes from MIT and other institutions of higher education. Society looks to higher education to solve current problems, anticipate future challenges, develop innovative solutions, and model the action and behavior that society must take to continue to evolve in a positive direction. The debate today has been chosen as a debate format to reinstitute what used to be a format for learning and education many, many years ago. And it is designed to eliminate all of the issues that the panelists think are important. It will last for 1 hour and 15 minutes. The core part of the debate will be for 42 minutes. There will be 25 minutes of question from the audience and a panelist response. That is why it's important to use your technology to let Sarah Rylinsky know what your questions are. And there will be 6 minutes of closing arguments by each team. While the debate format is cast as a for and against fossil fuel divestment, the teams are free to suggest other ways to use endowment management besides or in addition to divestment to moving society on a more sustainable path. Let me briefly introduce the panelists. For the PRO team, we have Don Gould, the founder, president, and chief investment officer of Gould Asset Management of Claremont, California. And he's also a trustee and a chair of the investment committee at Pitzer College in Claremont. Welcome. Here you go. Of course, you know, they put the pro on the left side. Did you notice that? Naomi Oreskes is a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and environmental sciences at Harvard University, and an internationally recognized expert on the development of scientific knowledge. She is an author of numerous books, including Merchants of Doubt, which has recently been turned into a film and recently released. John Sturman is the J.W. Forrester Professor in Computer Science, a Professor of System Dynamics and Engineering Systems, and the Director of Systems Dynamics Group at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His research centers on improving decision-making on complex systems, focusing on environmental sustainability, climate change, and process improvement in organizations. For the opposing team, we have Brad Hager. Hi, Brad. He is a professor of Earth Sciences in the Department of Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences. And his research interest and expertise is in the relationship between space geodetic observations of surface deformation, earthquakes, and dynamical processes in the Earth's interior. He knows what's going on in the Earth's crust. The second member of the group is Frank Wollett. Frank is a Holbrook Working Professor of Commodity Price Studies in the Department of Economics at Stanford. And he specializes in the study of privatization, competition, and regulation in network industries such as electricity, telecommunications, water supply, natural gas, and postal delivery services. And finally, Tim Smith. He serves as the Director of Environmental, Social, and Governance Shareholder Engagement at Walden Asset Management. The best way to describe Tim is that he is the father of shareholder engagement with corporations to push them on a more socially responsible space, beginning in 1971. He served previously as the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. Please welcome all of the panelists. I will now turn to the PRO team, which will have 4 minutes for its opening argument.
Thank you, Tony. Mark Twain famously said, "Always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest." Today we argue that divestment is not only right, it is vital to support the policies urgently needed to prevent potentially catastrophic climate change. Further, divestment is necessary to preserve the integrity of MIT and our commitment to the scientific method, the MIT way Maria described. The stakes are immense. There's no longer any reasonable doubt that climate change is real, happening now, caused primarily by humans, and poses grave risks to our future. Concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere now exceeds 400 parts per million, and it's rising fast. CO2 levels have not been this high since the Pliocene 3 million years ago, at which time sea level is 66 feet higher than today. We all live in the United States. I'm going to use English units, not the SI system today. We have not yet seen the full impact of the fossil fuels we have already burned. But we have already warmed our world almost halfway to the limit of 2 degrees C, that's 3.6 Fahrenheit, that nearly all nations on Earth have endorsed as the most warming we can safely tolerate. The impacts are already being felt, from collapsing ice sheets to increases in drought, wildfire, extreme weather, ocean acidification, and others. Worse, a wide range of studies, including many done right here at MIT, show that continued reliance on fossil fuels, business as usual, is expected to warm our world by 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2100. There is, of course, uncertainty, but it is not our friend. We might get lucky with warming of only 6 degrees, still far above the target. But there's an equal chance warming could be 13 degrees or even higher. The distribution has a fat tail. We face a large probability of warming so great and so rapid that the result would be nothing short of a Holocaust, in which all will suffer, especially the poor and future generations. Continued fossil fuel extraction is therefore not merely an issue of science, technology, and economics. It is also and fundamentally a moral issue, and we must take a stand. Even the sober scientists of the IPCC recognize, and I quote, the importance of governance, ethical dimensions, and equity, unquote, in addressing this threat. So what must we do? To quote the IPCC again, limiting climate change will require substantial and sustained reductions of greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. Yet the fossil fuel industry has already found enough coal, oil, and gas to warm the world to 9 degrees, not once, but at least 3 times over. They actively seek to find and produce even more. As Professor Estes will describe, they have and continue to fund deniers, undermine the science, confuse the public, and delay action. Actions antithetical to the values of MIT. The integrity of the Institute is at stake. We cannot say that we care about climate change while we invest in an industry that threatens our prosperity, our health, and our lives. The urgency of the threat means we must work to free ourselves of fossil fuels on multiple fronts starting now. And we at MIT are developing the technologies to produce clean, renewable energy and use it efficiently. We're working to reduce our campus carbon footprint. We publish our research and we brief policymakers. But these actions are not enough. Cutting our emissions will not matter unless emissions also fall around the world. Briefing policymakers will not matter without public support for the right policies. Politics always trumps PowerPoint. We call on the Institute to, as Twain said, do right. Divestment is not only right, it is powerful. We will not only astonish, we will walk our talk, we will energize the growing movement to cut emissions on campus and around the world, and thus we will fulfill the mission of MIT, which calls upon us, quote, to work wisely, creatively, and effectively for the betterment of humankind. Thank you.
John? The opposing team? Rebuttal?
Tim Smith, I'll make one quick comment, and that is that the analysis that we've just heard about the impact of climate change is widely embraced by people I work with too. This is an extremely significant issue that we all face. It's a social issue. It's a climate issue. We would embrace what you just said. I don't think that automatically, of course, leads to only one conclusion, the sale of stock being the approach that you must take, although it certainly is one and very significant option for a university or a foundation or a religious group. But I just want to make the point that I think that this is a debate, but I don't want anybody in the room to feel that the people who are speaking about other options besides divestment don't embrace what is said about the grave crisis we face.
Right. I agree that climate change is a very serious problem and involves issues of integrity and morality. I think there's no disagreement. The disagreement is on how we see these. Poverty and social injustice are also very serious problems. And poverty, social injustice, climate change are all mixed together in energy policy. It's going to take a while to get to a situation where renewables can provide sufficient energy for the impoverished people in the world. We've got ours, they need to get theirs. So I think we need to take a systems analysis, I'm surprised to say that to the distinguished speaker, but we should not focus only on climate change, but we should also focus on fossil fuels in a broader context and try to understand if we eliminate fossil fuels, what will happen to the rest of the world.
Frank?
I would just, since we're quoting famous authors, I would quote Pogo as my favorite author, which is, "We have met the enemy and he is us." Why is it that those fossil fuel companies produce all those fossil fuels? Why do they search for the fossil fuels? It's because we demand them to heat our homes, to drive our cars, to fly on our airplanes. They're only providing the demand that for the services that we would like, and that is the unfortunate reality that exists. Essentially, divestiture does nothing to address that problem, simply because as long as demand is still there for the fossil fuels, the greenhouse gas emissions will exist, regardless of who owns the assets of the company that is producing those fossil fuels. If demand is still there, those greenhouse gases are going to occur unless we come up with a way to essentially mitigate the emissions associated with that, either through sequestration or other mechanisms.
Let me now then turn to the opposing team for your opening remarks. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. I think we can all agree, as we just discussed, that fossil fuel divestitures by universities is a symbolic gesture that sadly will have no measurable impact on global greenhouse gas emissions or the behavior of the companies that produce fossil fuels. Just to give an example, the global public equity market is about $60 trillion of market capitalization, and MIT's endowment is roughly $13 billion, or less than 0.02% of world capitalization. Even putting together all U.S. universities' endowments yields about $500 billion, which is still less than 1% of world capitalization. And unless these divestment actions reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, global greenhouse gas emissions will be unaffected by these actions. The companies that supply these products will continue to earn profits because that is what people demand. It's just that different people will be earning these profits besides the universities that divest. So if one is going to make the argument, I think, for fossil fuel divestiture, then yes, I agree with the other side that it must be on moral grounds. And by this I mean the moral imperative that I think many of us feel that to address the climate challenge and our collective desire at research universities to take a leading role in this effort. And I tend to think that MIT and other major research universities are in a unique position to be major forces for meaningful progress towards addressing this pressing global problem. And why? Because they happen to have the smartest students and certainly most motivated students. They also have the faculty that do the most influential research, engage in the most effective outreach activities, and let's not forget the outstanding staff that essentially supports these activities. So to get to the point, the primary reason I don't support fossil fuel divestiture is I believe that a university like MIT can do better. It can do much more to actually address the global climate challenge rather than falling back on a purely symbolic, divisive, and largely ineffective gesture like fossil fuel divestiture. What we can do is directly in line with its teaching and research mission and the goals that Maria Zuber outlined, and essentially has the potential to jumpstart a process for rapidly achieving significant reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. So what can universities do? Well, there's widespread agreement that setting a global price on carbon is the most effective approach to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. As I tell my students, a credible and predictable price of carbon into the distant future will cause investors to avoid activities that produce significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions because they will have to pay the cost of these emissions over the life of the project. A price of carbon will also provide funding to companies to invest in technologies that essentially limit the greenhouse gas emissions with the production and consumption of fossil fuels. And to be sure, there are many technical, political, economic challenges associated with designing a comprehensive mechanism for pricing carbon that achieves these goals. But what better way to solve these problems than to apply the collective intelligence and enthusiasms of students, faculty, and staff at major research universities? If universities can provide an approach to pricing greenhouse gas emissions content of all goods and services associated with their activities, and refund those revenues in a manner that is revenue neutral, and this process can be scaled to national and international jurisdictions, then this is clearly going to provide a path forward for global climate change policies. And moreover, if these universities can share their experiences and bring other international universities into the carbon pricing fold, the global impact of these activities will be even greater. Education and teaching, that's what we're good at. Now imagine what could be achieved by implementing a university-wide carbon pricing policy. This would entail many interdisciplinary research and teaching opportunities, and essentially involve students and faculty in the process and scale to the scale necessary to achieve a global carbon pricing process that's necessary to address the climate change.
Thank you. And now the PRO team to rebut.
Thank you very much. So Professor Wallach argues that divestment is only symbolic. But I want to say, first of all, that symbols matter. There's a reason why billions of people around the globe wear crosses around their necks, yarmulkes on their heads, scarves around their necks. Symbols matter because they signal our intent, and they invite other people to join in our intent. We've all agreed that scientists have proven the reality of man-made climate change beyond any reasonable doubt, but that has not led to the necessary political and social response. We can invent great technologies, but if they aren't available and affordable because of subsidies to their competitors, they won't do the job. Even now, we see the fossil fuel industry funding disinformation against renewables. Now, Professor Wallach argues for a carbon price, and we agree completely. But this brings us to the question, how do we get a carbon price? The idea of a carbon price is a very old one. It's been advocated, the notion of Pigouvian taxes go back at least to the 1920s, and it was advocated famously by Senator Gore when he called it a BTU tax. But how do we get the political will to pass a carbon tax? Political and social action is about creating political will to get the public policies that will do the job so effectively that Professor Wallach argues for. So to juxtapose divestment against the carbon tax is a false dichotomy. They're part of a large-scale strategy. Divestment is part of a strategy to spur the political action which will lead to the carbon tax that we completely agree is very strongly needed.
Professor Wallach also argues that divestment would be divisive and would politicize the issue. Unfortunately, this issue is already highly politicized. And there's no political will or ability right now to get to the global carbon tax that would provide a credible and durable price that we all agree is very important here. Just here in Massachusetts last November, the voters failed to pass by quite a large margin a measure that would have indexed the gasoline tax to inflation. Wouldn't have raised it, just indexed it to inflation. Congress last year refused to increase the gasoline tax at the federal level, almost bankrupting the Highway Trust Fund for similar reasons. This issue is already politicized. The MIT way is to focus on science, and the social science and the psychology shows us clearly that this is not merely a question of economics, and simply providing people with more facts will not matter.
Now, if your time is up for rebuttal, and now it's time for the PRO team to make its next argument.
Like my colleagues, I support divestment from a sense of urgency about climate change. Urgency that is informed by my work as a historian who has spent the last 15 years studying what scientists have learned about climate change. Climate scientists have told us that 2 degrees centigrade is likely to be the safe limit for global warming. Yet already we are seeing damaging and costly climate-related effects, including sea level rise, ocean acidification, and worsening of droughts, wildfires, and floods. The troubling thing is that none of this comes as a surprise. Scientists predicted this decades ago. In 1992, the United States signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, committing the world to controlling the greenhouse gases that drive disruptive climate change. But that did not happen. Why not? The answer is complex, but one of the major reasons is the campaign of denial that was organized, promoted, and largely funded by the fossil fuel industry. For more than 20 years, this industry has promoted a message of doubt, whose sole purpose was to delay action on climate change, to delay the transition away from their products, fossil fuels, to less damaging alternatives. Alternatives that existed and which could have been competitive in the marketplace had the right public policies been in place. How did they do this? First, by challenging the science and claiming that the evidence was less robust than our scientists, including men and women in this room, told us that it was. Second, by attacking scientists. Distinguished scientists such as Lawrence Livermore's Ben Santer and Stanford's Stephen Schneider were falsely accused of scientific misconduct and exaggerating the threat for personal gain. The purpose and the effect of these attacks was to undermine public confidence in science, to undermine public trust in the work that we do at great universities like Harvard and MIT. Third, by aggressively lobbying against reasonable public policies, including a carbon tax. To give just one example from my home state, many studies show that emissions trading can be an effective mechanism to control pollution. But when California passed AB 32, an emissions trading system, the fossil fuel industry led a well-funded campaign to repeal it, disguised as a grassroots referendum. These activities strike at the core of our mission and refute the suggestion that we can solve climate change by continuing to lay the scientific foundation for informed public policy or by developing better, more efficient technologies. What we have learned through our research is that science is not enough. Even technology is not enough. Not when there are organizations and institutions working to undermine public trust in them. That is what the fossil fuel industry has done in the past and continues to do today. There is a second reason I support divestment, and I speak here as the geologist that I was originally trained as. The world sits on reserves of fossil fuels so large that if burned, they would push climate change not merely past the 2-degree limit, but well past 5 degrees, maybe 10, 15, or even more. No one who understands the science thinks that even 4 degrees of climate change would be manageable. The World Bank has said that 4 degrees would roll back decades of development. And this is why the bank concludes that, quote, we are now at a make it or break it point in time. Yet staggeringly, the fossil fuel industry continues to search for still more reserves, including for energy sources like tar sand, shale oil, and shale gas that are even more damaging than traditional sources. Their business model is structured on activities that virtually guarantee massive, severe, disruptive, and costly climate change. How do we stop this race to the bottom? The answer is by starting here and now. The International Energy Agency says we have until 2017 to stop all fossil fuel infrastructure construction. We must stop investing in the industries that are driving us towards crisis.
Thank you. The opposing team, 3 minutes for a
I just wanted to say that I'm surprised that my colleagues have so little faith in the ability of education to change the world. I think that essentially teaching students about how to actually address the climate challenge, working with faculty, sending those students out in the world is the way that we change the world. The other point that I'd say is that I think that we're painting the fossil fuel industry with a bit too broad a brush. I think many of the fossil fuel companies are actually on the record as supporting a price of carbon. What they typically aren't supporting is the general morass that gets through the political process associated with that. The other is that I think that the evidence is quite clear from virtually all businesses that if you set the rules, the businesses will operate within the rules that are set. And it's our job as citizens to put in a set of rules that achieve the outcomes that we would like to see. And then finally, I guess I would say in the case of California, being in California, I think that the experience of what happened with the attempts to repeal AB 32 are also instructive to the point that we talked about, which is education, outreach, giving people an understanding of how AB 32 is actually going to work, essentially was, I think, a large part of how that ballot initiative was in fact defeated. So I think that the citizens of America are far more able to understand what is necessary to solve this problem than we often give them credit for. And pricing carbon is the way to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. Divesting fossil fuel companies, if we continue to consume all the fossil fuels that we consume, will do absolutely nothing to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions.
I'd like to follow up on this point that the opposition is painting a lot of this problem with too broad a brush. All energy companies are not the same. They have different practices. And since I'm also a geologist, all fossil fuels are not the same. Coal is much worse than natural gas. The shale gas revolution has actually led to a decrease in our carbon footprint. So we need to apply some discrimination, and that's what's wrong with this divest movement. It throws everything out, rather than making thoughtful choices about what is good and what we should keep and what we should get rid of.
Okay, time for the opposing team to make its next argument. You have 4 minutes.
Thank you. So you heard I work in an investment firm here in Boston, Walden Asset Management. We manage approximately $3 billion for our clients. They are all committed to making sure that environmental, social, and governance issues are reflected in their investments. And a number of them have embraced divestment as the approach that they feel best represents the ways they want to have their portfolio managed. And we manage those portfolios for them. We also have numerous clients who have chosen to be active and engaged shareholders, trying to use the power and leverage of themselves as investors to challenge companies. You also heard that I work for the religious coalition, ICCR, for 30 years. And we were very active in leading the anti-apartheid movement along with other investors. And my conclusion from that is that over those 2 decades, those campaigns, which included the sale of stock, included shareholder resolutions, they included boycotts and legislation and demonstrations, and the list goes on. But interestingly enough, when you need a large social movement to bring about change, the combination of those pressures played an important role. I would make a point that a university, a foundation, a religious group, who does nothing with its investment portfolio, basically sits on its hands, is in a very weak place in this debate. They fall into the easy use of the slogan, use it or lose it. So I'm going to talk about how investors are actively involved in, some investors actively involved in using their shares to put pressure on the very credible issue that we've heard described about the crisis of climate change. So just as there's an impressive coalition of organizations, individuals who are advocating for divestment, I just want to also remind people that there's a long-standing coalition of investors that are actively advocating pressure on fossil fuel companies. And they also have had, actually some of them, 2 decades of history. One of them is led by Ceres, the coalition based here in Boston, who just recently had a statement on the crisis on climate change and the need for action, having investors with $24 trillion of assets under management. And CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, has investors with $95 trillion of assets under management, calling on companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and their plans to reducing them. I put these numbers on the table just to make a simple point, that there are investors who are actively using their voice and vote on the climate issue. Have they done enough? Certainly not. Have they successfully turned around oil and gas companies? Not even close. Do they have a seat at the table with top executives? Absolutely. Are they on the same page with the issues that we've heard described, such as the need to look at stranded assets? Certainly they are very close. And the issues they raise, I will conclude with describing some of them, are issues that are crucial to the climate debate. They call on companies to end flaring and reduce methane emissions, to track and disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, to set greenhouse gas reduction goals. And they challenge, just like Naomi said, they challenge financial contributions to groups like ALEC that oppose regulations for renewables. So you will see a group of investors, and I'll close with this point, globally, but certainly very active in the United States with some of the biggest pension funds in this country, actively petitioning major fossil fuel companies to turn and move to a new direction on a renewable energy economy. Thank you.
The pro team has the 3 minutes to rebut.
I'd first like to respond to something Professor Woloch said, that divestment will have no impact on the companies from which we are divesting. I think this represents a very common misconception about what divestment is really about. Divestment is not aimed at the oil companies or the coal companies. Divestment is aimed at the policymakers who have to formulate a policy that will provide for a habitable planet. We don't expect selling oil stocks, coal stocks, is going to change the behavior of the fossil fuel industry. I think a second important point, Professor Woloch talked about the demand side of the equation. And I think this, again, is another misconception. People don't demand fossil fuels, they demand energy. And so the idea that we must have fossil fuels and that is the only answer to our energy needs is, I think, fundamentally flawed, and we have to stop looking at the problem that way. I'd also like to quickly respond to something Tim Smith said about engagement, shareholder engagement. We support shareholder engagement, and we think, and I think Tim would agree, that it would be a false dichotomy to say that divestment and engagement are mutually exclusive. They are not. But I think it is questionable to expect a coal producer to stop producing coal as a result of shareholder engagement. It does not require a large holding in a public company to be an engaged shareholder. So let me stop there.
I'd like to pick up a point that was raised by Professor Woloch, that we are the enemy because we are the ones who demand the fossil fuels and the producers simply accommodate that demand. Certainly we agree with much of that sentiment, but there is an important distinction. We can imagine, and the companies in the automobile industry, the food industry, and all the other industries that we depend on do not need fossil fuels in the long run, as it's not essential to their core business, whereas it is essential to the core business of the fossil fuel industries. We can make cars that don't require fossil energy. We cannot have oil extraction that does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a major difference between the companies we depend on and the fossil fuel industries, and divestment focuses the political pressure on that issue.
And I want to quickly just add, of course we believe in education. We wouldn't be here today, we wouldn't be professors if we hadn't dedicated our entire lives to education. But one of the things that we have learned in the last 20 years, that I've learned through my research published in peer-reviewed journals, is that education is necessary but not sufficient. And one of the reasons for that, there are many reasons why that's true, but one of the key reasons in this case is because of the disinformation campaigns that have been funded by the fossil fuel industry. More than half of the American people still do not believe that climate change is driven by greenhouse gas emissions and other activities to humans. And that's a direct consequence of disinformation. As for the fossil fuel industry, no one is saying that all fossil fuel companies are exactly the same. A sensible divestment strategy can look closely at that case, at these individual cases, and may decide that in some cases, some companies may be ones we hold on to, but we would begin to look at all of the fossil fuel industry for their role in perpetuating this situation which is driving us towards crisis.
Okay, it is now time for the pro team to have another argument. You have 4 minutes.
I am the founder and president of an investment management company based in Southern California and have been a practitioner in the industry for more than 30 years. I am also a trustee and chair of the investment committee at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. 1 year ago to this week, Pitzer announced a comprehensive climate action plan, including our decision to divest substantially all of the college's endowment of fossil fuel stocks by the end of 2014, an objective which was met. Pitzer's divestment sought two key objectives, and both are equally valid and achievable for MIT. First, divestment changes the public discourse on our collective energy future. Its message is aimed not at oil companies, but at those who must craft a public policy consistent with a habitable planet. Divestment is a powerful tool for changing society's norms, for redefining sound policy. Divestment implores us to place society's interests above those of one industry, no matter how rich and powerful. Second, divestment aligns the institution's actions with its values. A university actively committed to engineering a sustainable future for humanity should not be betting its endowment dollars on the opposite outcome. It is a conflict of interest, plain and simple. The business plan of the world's major fossil fuel companies, as they openly admit, is to sell 100% of their known reserves and to continue to spend hundreds of billions of dollars each and every year in search of yet more reserves, every last ounce of which they plan to see burned one day. MIT should not be complicit in this reckless and dangerous vision of the future. The fossil fuel divestment movement is steadily gaining momentum worldwide. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Stanford and Syracuse universities, the United Nations, all have endorsed divestment, and the list grows weekly. It can be done, and it is being done. In fact, according to an Oxford University study, fossil fuel divestment is the fastest growing divestment movement in history. Why is this so? Because of the simple and incontrovertible logic that we must stop betting against our own future. And because fossil fuel divestment makes explicit what so many of us know, yet so few are willing to say aloud, namely that conventional political processes are failing to inject the necessary urgency into our global climate action, and that a bolder form of leadership is necessary. Many of us will discuss today the portfolio and fiduciary implications of a divestment action. As an investment manager and a college trustee, I am keenly aware of these issues. And having spent the better part of 2 years thinking specifically about how they relate to divestment, it has become clear to me that the cost of inaction now dwarfs any theoretical cost of action. And that fiduciary duty, which is the duty to represent the university's true and long-term best interests, compels us to divest. The MIT climate conversation is about formulating a comprehensive, multifaceted climate action plan that is the very best MIT can do. Divestment is only one element of such a plan, but it is a critical element, because amidst all the technological and economic tools that we must surely bring to bear on the climate challenge, it is only divestment that can create the social and political momentum necessary to effect real change. On issues of great moral consequence, and climate change is surely that, the university has a duty to educate not only its students, but also society at large. MIT, as a global thought leader, has today a singular opportunity to advance the world's climate conversation. By taking the courageous action of fossil fuel divestment, MIT will shake to the core the prevailing foundations of complacency, inertia, and resignation from Cambridge to Calcutta. MIT has an opportunity to lead. MIT has a duty to lead. MIT must divest. Thank you.
Thank you. Opposing team?
Yes, sure. 3 minutes. So let's look at this question of the ability of divestiture to create social change. There's a fairly well-known study published in a peer-reviewed journal that essentially looks at a very important implication of divestment, which is boycott of South African companies and investments in South Africa during the apartheid period. The evidence from this research says there was virtually no change in the valuation of any of the companies associated and who had their stocks divested If anything, the more interesting thing is that the value of stocks in South Africa were in fact higher during the period with the greatest political pressure. So I think that certainly the empirical evidence in favor of divestment having any impact in terms of in causing social change, at least empirically, is limited to be generous. The other is that the issue of conflict of interest. I think there's a more fundamental conflict of interest here, and that is the fact that how can we say don't invest in something that we consume every single day at the university? That right there is an even more sort of conflict of interest right from the start. The last point I think that should be rebutted is that the fact that there is a significant fraction of the American population that does not believe in global warming. I think, yes, you can say that the folks that have tried to employ climate deniers have been in part successful, but I think we should take the lesson from what happened with smoking, is that education, research, eventually what happens is that it comes out and everyone understands it. And I think that the same is true with respect to global warming. We need to get the message out, to get people to understand that, to educate, to do more research, and that is what universities are very good at doing, to essentially make the case to people that are surely well-intentioned and would like to understand what is going on and make the right decision for their children and their children's children.
I'd like to build on this point of whether divestment affects stock price and how divestment affects people in the boardroom. I think maybe the pro side has downplayed the fact that divestment can have a very significant impact in the boardroom. I can remember the head of ITT during the South African debate not saying that their stock had been affected, good point made by my colleague, but saying, I hate to see our stock being dumped all around this country. So in fact, the symbol of selling your stock can have an effect. I'm still going to make the same point I was making before. Those divestment campaigns in the 70s, 80s in South Africa were matched by some of the biggest investment groups in this country, filing shareholder resolutions with virtually every major company that was in South Africa. That had an effect in the boardroom as well. And I go back to the theme that those two approaches actually send a message to top management that the Wall Street Journal called the hassle factor. No top executive could walk the streets without having to deal with the South African issue.
Okay, the opposing team now has 3.5 minutes, because you went over, to make your next argument.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. 4 minutes. All right.
This debate is about MIT, so I'm going to end our presentation by talking about MIT. 25 years ago, I joined MIT because I believe that this is the best place in the world to work solving essential and difficult problems. Here we do the hard work of analyzing the problems as objectively as we can, breaking them into tractable components, proposing solutions, and testing these solutions against available evidence. Let me provide some evidence from my personal experience at MIT. For most of my career, I focused on problems in pure earth science, like how and how fast the mountains melt. But the glaciers I've seen retreating, the pollution I've experienced, and the human suffering and social inequity I've witnessed trouble me greatly. Because I believe that along with the privilege of working at MIT comes responsibility, I switched my research focus from pure to applied science. With very talented students and colleagues, I now work on environmental problems with results that are possible only because of collaborations with oil companies. Let me emphasize that working with oil companies, I have learned that their positions on global warming and the environment span a broad spectrum. Some have an irresponsible cowboy mentality, plundering and laying waste. The worst actors tend to be privately held companies. We can neither own nor divest in shares of them, and regulation is the only solution. Others are much more invested in a sustainable future. For example, Shell leadership is actively promoting a price on carbon preferring the stable business environment that a carbon price would provide. One problem that we work on is geologic sequestration of carbon dioxide, important to the reduction of global warming. We're learning how to capture and store carbon dioxide safely and permanently without triggering dangerous earthquakes. Part of my research is supported by oil companies hoping to avoid dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. As well as funding, these companies contribute access to large-scale field projects and essential data. Second, we're working on improving the efficiency and decreasing the environmental impact of hydrofracturing. This is another problem calling for an MIT-like approach, again, supported by a fossil fuel company. Despite economic growth, the shift from coal to gas in the United States has led to a decreasing CO2 emissions over the past several years. And while we must continue to move away from carbon-based energy, the energy independence made possible by fracking points toward a world that is both cleaner and politically more stable. The final example, our work on induced seismicity. The Netherlands has cut its production of natural gas because of concern about inducing earthquakes. This makes Europe more dependent on gas from an expansionist Russia, also more dependent on burning dirty coal. Despite Europe's well-publicized shift to renewables, its carbon footprint is going up while ours is going down. Facilitating gas production in Europe by reducing the risk of triggering earthquakes has positive geopolitical implications, along with climate and environmental ones. So our experience tells us that addressing climate change successfully requires engaging strongly and positively with those companies committed to our standards and goals. For example, did you know that through the MIT Energy Initiative, the largest project in solar power research at MIT is funded by an oil company? So to end, we must not blindly stigmatize the companies that have the resources and the experience with massive infrastructure that are essential to solving the couple energy, climate, social equity problems. We should engage those who are moving or can be nudged in the right direction. We have a responsibility to a threatened world to promote and apply the scientific expertise, excellence, and collaboration that are hallmarks of MIT.
Thank you. 3 minutes for the process.
Let me first respond to something Professor Wolak said, the topic of hypocrisy, that somehow it's hypocritical for us to divest the fossil fuel stocks while still consuming them. I have a quote here from James Lawrence Powell, who actually has a PhD in geochemistry from MIT and is the former president of Reed, Oberlin, and Franklin and Marshall Colleges. He said, quote, "Which is more inconsistent, for a university to divest from fossil fuel companies while remaining embedded in a carbon economy in other ways, or to profit from products that threaten the university's own future, that of its alumni, and even civilization itself?" I'd also like to respond to something Professor Hager said. If it's, and this is a rhetorical question, but if it is the case that fossil fuel companies are sincerely supporting a carbon tax, then I have 2 questions. One, why is there no carbon tax? Because as far as I can tell, everybody else supports it. And second, why are the fossil fuel companies spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year in capital expenditures to seek ever more reserves, which under a carbon tax scenario would be economically not worthwhile? So I think there's not very strong evidence that the part of the fossil fuel industry is really in favor of a carbon tax.
Let me amplify Don's point about whether it's a conflict of interest, as Professor Wolak said, hypocritical for us to continue to use fossil fuels if we divest. If we accept that logic, it would mean that we could not, if we lived in England or the United States in the early 1800s, oppose slavery and the slave trade because the economy was built on the bitter fruit of those odious practices. It would mean that if we lived in the Soviet Union, we could not oppose that hateful system because that system provided us with our job, our income, and our apartment. That is not an acceptable position. We were all born into a system dependent on fossil fuels. That does not mean that we cannot oppose it.
Thank you. The opposition, I think, also misses the point about the purpose of divestment. The purpose of divestment is not to affect the value of stocks, but to bring about social change. And the fact is, the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, both Nelson Mandela and Bishop Desmond Tutu, have stated that they believe that divestment played a very crucial role in creating momentum against apartheid. And it's for this reason that Bishop Desmond Tutu has lent his support to fossil fuel divestment, explicitly making an analogy to his country's fight against apartheid and calling divestment, quote, one of the tactics that work in South Africa. I've done a lot of research on the history of smoking, and so have my colleagues at Harvard and elsewhere. Smoking did not decrease in the United States because of research and education. I wish it had. We all wish it had. But the truth is, it was social pressure, it was lawsuits, and it was the prosecution of the tobacco industry by the U.S. Department of Justice that led to social change on tobacco. Research and education laid the foundation. They're absolutely essential. We believe in them. But research and education by themselves are not enough, and we know this from past experience.
Thank you. We now turn to the section of the debate to respond to questions from the audience. There are a number of questions that ask the following. What is the downside to MIT or any college or university by divesting of fossil fuels? Is there a financial penalty? Is there something that, if you decide to do that, that will be a serious problem? So I'm going to first ask this side 1 minute per response, please.
So, Don and I were talking about this earlier. There's all sorts of studies and serious research being done on fiduciary duty and is there a financial penalty from divestment. In fact, there's a number of studies, I think Don will point to this too, that indicate it can be done and your portfolio doesn't suffer significant consequences. But these are early days, and if you have $13 billion, you are required, you're a pension fund with $25 billion, you are required to very carefully analyze the impact on your portfolio. We do manage portfolios for people, as I said earlier, for institutions who want them to be fossil fuel free. They actually don't just choose oil and gas companies. They look at companies that are also major users and have major carbon footprints and try to avoid those as well. Fortunately, those portfolios have competitive returns. We have not seen a penalty. So I don't think the debate should focus solely, Tony, on whether you're going to lose mountains of money by not owning these companies. In this particular economy, you're actually making money. 5 years ago, you would have been losing money.
Okay. 1 minute for the chair side.
There have been many studies on this. I'll just recite a couple numbers. From the period 1988 through 2013, a U.S. carbon-free portfolio outperformed the Russell 3000 index by about 5 basis points. That's 0.05% per year. It's essentially nothing. The standard deviation, i.e. the risk of the portfolios, was also almost identical. If you look actually at a global portfolio over the period where data is available, 1997 to 2013, carbon-free portfolio actually outperformed the Morgan Stanley, the MSCI All-World Index by 0.3% per year, with again virtually identical standard deviation. I think it's important to say here that divestment cannot be done willy-nilly. It's a very important step. It must meet a very high test. It's not something you can do frequently, but I think the stakes in this case could not be higher, and that it easily does meet that test.
Okay, and a follow-up to that is, if you divest of fossil fuels, what should you be investing in?
Well, so there's many things we could invest in, as Don alluded to, and thank you, Tim, for making our point so clearly. We're very grateful. We could simply divest of fossil fuels and continue to have a highly diversified portfolio. Or we could place our investment, part of it, into the green technologies that are going to be the winners in the economy and help speed the transition that we need. We could create venture funds, incubators, and we do that already in some degree. Obviously, not all the endowment would go in that direction, but we could put our money behind the direction that we know we need to go.
I would just like to respond to the previous question, which is what's the cost? The cost is, I think Brad had alluded to it quite clearly, is that I seriously doubt that the companies that produce energy are going to be willing to work with MIT researchers to fund research at MIT if MIT decides that, gee, we're going to divest ourselves of all investments in fossil fuel companies. The other is that if essentially investments in fossil fuels could be eliminated and you still get the same returns as you could without investing in fossil fuels, wouldn't you have done it already? And so I think that really begs the question of whether or not there really is a cost, a long-term cost. Since clearly if you prefer not to invest and you can get the same return, you'd already be doing it.
Tony, can I just make one correction here? I think it's a very important question. What do we invest in if we sell 200 stocks in the oil and gas companies? Our desire would be invest in a renewable energy future. There are not 200 companies out there in the large cap space that we can choose. Most of those companies that are in that space are smaller companies or they're private equity. So if you're managing a portfolio, you don't just take the money out of 200 companies and immediately have other choices in that same sector. That doesn't mean it can't be done, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking for green and renewable energy investment options. Don can quickly testify to that. But it is not a simplistic, we're going to divest and the money can quickly go into a green and renewable energy space.
That begs exactly another question that has come up, which is how do we reduce the demand for the use of fossil fuels? And the follow-up to that question is, do we have to be moving money just from fossil fuels to renewable energy? Could we be investing in things that sustainable transportation or reducing energy consumption as an alternative to the investment of fossil fuels? 1 minute, please.
So we're already doing a lot of this. We need to do more. But I want to address this issue that Professor Wallach raised of if there actually was no penalty, we would have done it already. This is a very frequent argument that we hear that there can't be any free lunches, there can't be any win-win investment opportunities. It's just not true. Right here on this campus, we have developed new buildings and retrofitted old buildings at negative cost. The new Sloan building has less than half the energy consumption of the standard code-compliant building, and the net present value of our energy efficiency investments there is $10 million. There's $100 million NPV opportunity for the campus as a whole. The payback time on many of these retrofit and other efficiency programs is significantly less than a year. Anything that exists is possible. It's because there's market failure that these win-win opportunities exist.
I would just only say, I think even within your own university, you have some colleagues that may disagree with your statement. But the other thing I'd say is that in terms of the investments and the way to reduce demand, very simple. If you price the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from the consumption of fossil fuels, you will get less greenhouse gas emissions from the consumption of fossil fuels. It's really that simple. And moreover, you will also have the funds necessary to invest in the sorts of technologies that Brad is developing in his research.
You want to add something?
Yeah, if I might. Yeah. So just briefly, divestment is a symbolic act, and MIT does not have much street cred for divesting from fossil fuels because we are in the upper 10th of a percent of fossil fuel footprint per capita. Okay, we have people who jet all around the world. We set up the Singapore Institute. We launch rockets. A more positive step and a leading step would be for MIT to educate the world on how to grapple with how to have a high-class program and reduce your carbon footprint. So we should do something We should show the world how to reduce our carbon footprint, not blame the fossil fuels for the carbon we use.
May I respond briefly to that?
Yes.
The opposition keeps putting this as a dichotomy, an either or, whereas our argument is both and. We absolutely believe in a carbon tax. We've already made that point. The question is, how do we get the social and political will to implement a carbon tax, an idea that's been around for a long time? We absolutely believe in reducing our carbon footprint, and Professor Sturman has been a leader on this campus in doing that. Again, it's both and. But we have a very serious problem about the way the fossil fuel industry is continuing to promote not just the use of fossil fuels, but the expanded exploration for it. And that's the crux of the issue that divestment calls attention to.
So I like that both and approach. And what I'd like to suggest is that at least we put it out in the room that a lower chair. One both-and approach is the divestment movement and investors with trillions of dollars of assets under management who are supporting a carbon tax, who have spoken out about this, and are supporting our government as it moves into Paris to have a brand new global agreement. Now, wouldn't that be interesting if we could, instead of just disagreeing about a strategy, find some, keep the disagreement going, but find some ways in which we could work together to have that moral energy of investors who, believe me, the pension funds in this world that I work with are not about to walk away from all their fossil fuel companies, but they sure can be pressed and effectively use their voice along with the divestment movement to call for changes in policy to support the carbon tax. See, Frank, it's not, I'm still on this side.
Let me just point out that I pointed out at the beginning of the forum that one of the challenges with the pro and con is that it's really a dichotomous kind of approach. And a more nuanced approach is what is more typical of the way I think an academic community would think about it. And so even though we joke that, Tim, you should have moved to the other side, the fact is that this is not, there's not a simple answer to this issue. So let me end up with one question which comes up over and over again. If it's widely understood that fossil fuels are such a serious problem and might be irrelevant within the next 15 years due to technology disruption or regulations, would it not make sense that MIT lead on shifting of investment to the emerging and disruptive technologies? Each side. 1 minute.
I mean, certainly it makes sense that you would be trying to focus on the disruptive technologies because those are going to be the big financial winners. On the other hand, it's very difficult to know which those are in advance. And I think Brad's point is correct that you can't simply say that the proceeds from divestment will automatically find a good home in sustainability investments. At Pitzer, we created a sustainability sleeve within the endowment, but any dollar that's invested in that sleeve has to meet all of the same rigorous tests of internal rates of return and risk-reward trade-off as any other investment that we would make. So I think by all means, this is part of the answer as to where do you redeploy divested funds.
I think it's important to bear in mind that the returns in these renewable technologies are just not there. The reason that they're just not there is because fossil fuels are just too cheap. So if what you want to do is get the returns up in the renewable space, what you need to do is make fossil fuels more expensive. The way you make the consumption of fossil fuels more expensive is by pricing carbon. I hate to sound like a parrot economist, but that is the story to making alternative investments in renewable technology, energy efficiency, everything else economic to transition to the future that we're interested in. And I think that Students can understand that and move forward to try to implement that, because that is what is going to drive the transition. It's going to be what has driven the transition since the beginning of time is the relative prices of the goods and services that cause investors to invest money to provide those services that consumers demand.
We certainly need those market incentives, and in fact, right now, we do have companies all the way from Walmart to Apple and Microsoft who are betting that solar is a meaningful and reasonably priced alternative. And they are betting Apple is betting their pharma. They are moving to a zero carbon emissions source of energy. That's very significant, and they're doing it without the carbon tax yet being there, but they would also say you have to have a price on carbon if you're really going to make this trend accelerate at the speed we need to.
I just would caution that the other reason Apple's doing it is fantastic tax credits from the federal government as a result of the
Good, there we go, the market at work.
I want to go to the final question, which is directly relevant to this, and that is, it's been said, and this was a question that came here, it's been said that one of the greatest goals of higher education is to educate the policymakers. Right now, the policies for subsidies of fossil fuels are 6 times the subsidies for renewable technologies. So I'd like to ask either of the sides, this is a question that came up, what do you think needs to be done? What could MIT and other higher education institutions be doing to try to get the policies right? Is that with you?
So I'm really glad this question came out. Although Professor Wallach is absolutely right that the negative externalities of fossil fuels are not currently priced, and we need a carbon price to correct that market failure, that's only part of the market failure. Estimates from the IEA are that subsidies for fossil fuels are more than $500 billion a year, and other estimates from the World Bank put it up at $2 trillion a year. That's between a $15 and $60 per ton of CO2 negative price on carbon. Why does that exist? It's not only economics. It's primarily because of the political power of the fossil fuel industry. So the research shows that absolutely we need to correct those market failures, and we're not going to be able to do that. And again, the research shows this. We're not going to be able to do that just by telling people the economic, technical, and geophysical facts. It's a political, social issue about identity, about ideology. That's the peer-reviewed research, and we need to take that on board right here at MIT.
So, one very specific thing MIT could do is recognize the fact that they own stock in companies like Exxon and Chevron, who are vigorously, as we've heard, lobbying against changes in meaningful legislation. They're arguing against it at the state level with AB 32 in California. They support ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which opposes renewable energy regulations at the state level. It's their dollars that are helping make that happen. Yet MIT, as I understand it, and I'd like to be corrected, doesn't even vote its proxies on shareholder resolutions that will be put to Exxon and Chevron and other companies this spring, this month. So one thing MIT could do is take responsibility for the fact they're an owner of these companies, they profit from them, and their voice should be heard by voting their proxies and writing to companies and stating that they want to change in their public policy efforts.
I guess I would just like to comment that the number that you quoted on the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry would greatly benefit from a peer review process, would be the best thing that I could say.
It does come to the World Bank.
These are numbers that are severely, it depends on who you talk to as to what number you get. I honestly do not know what the right number is. I think that it requires a lot of specificity and a lot of discussion before you actually come up with that number. So I would just caution in terms of, depending on who you talk to, you'll get very different numbers.
Just to clarify something that I know happens to be true, is that the fossil fuel subsidies have been around for nearly a century, and the renewable energy subsidies have to be voted on every 3 or 4 years. There is stability, and with anything business likes in the market, it's stability. So you want
Just I had a quick comment again to thank Tim Smith for supporting our argument. So we don't have time to talk about this in great detail, but I just want to make the point that divestment doesn't have to be blunt and it doesn't have to be pig-headed. I wrote a piece I don't have time to talk about in detail, but in Naked Capitalism, you can look it up, talking about strategies for conditional divestment. And one of the things I said is that we should first and foremost ask all of these companies to immediately cease and desist from supporting ALEC and these other organizations that lobby against the carbon tax, against emissions trading, against all kinds of sensible, reasonable policies that Professor Wallach supports, and make that a condition for making a determination about whether we would or would not divest in that company.
Okay, we are now ready to wrap up. We're going to have closing arguments, 3 minutes on either side. We're going to take a 2-minute break so that each team can put together its closing argument. Now it's time for the closing arguments. 3 minutes on each side. We'll start with PRO.
Our message today is simple. MIT must divest. The MIT climate conversation is about building a comprehensive and multifaceted plan for addressing climate change, one that starts right here in Cambridge, but resounds worldwide. As a metaphor for MIT's climate action plan, I ask you for just a moment to think of a bicycle. The bike will have technological elements, wheels with spokes, rubber tires, brakes, and a solid lightweight frame. It will also have elements akin to economic equilibrium, a complex interplay of physical dynamics that permit the rider to balance upright. Now think of divestment as the pedals of the bicycle, the tool the rider uses to insert the energy necessary to reach the destination. Just as pedals alone do not make a bicycle, none of us would claim that divestment by itself is the answer to our pressing climate challenge. But a climate action plan without divestment is like a bicycle without pedals. It may be a thing of beauty, but it is not enough. We accept the opposing side's views that technological innovation, carbon pricing mechanisms, and even shareholder engagement under the right conditions are essential elements of a climate action plan. But what good are they if society lacks the political will to make them happen? A plan, however elegant, has value only if it can be put into action. That is why divestment is such a critical element of any serious plan to address our climate challenge. We are at a defining moment in history. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus, agreed to by all 6 of us debating here today, that we must urgently change our ways in order to avoid potentially catastrophic climate change. As a global society, we find ourselves paralyzed to act. Something is missing. The decision to divest requires analysis, for sure. But in the end, it takes something more. It takes courage. When the history of our time is written, and we come to the chapter about MIT's legacy in the larger climate conversation, let it show that MIT had the courage to act when Harvard and other prominent educational institutions chose not to. Let it show that MIT had the courage to lead and not follow. Let it show that MIT had the courage to take that long look in the mirror and then resolve to live up to its own ideals. Let it show that MIT had the courage to say, finally, enough, no more. No more will we bet against our own future. No more will we sit quietly while fossil fuel companies seek to undermine and even repudiate the very basis of scientific inquiry. No more will we passively wait for others to make the hard decisions. No more.
Thank you. Closing arguments? You may close it.
I guess our view is that we're better off to engage with both the shareholders, to engage with the companies that produce fossil fuels rather than stigmatize them. The simple point being is that there are many well-intentioned, well-meaning, environmentally conscious people working and managing fossil fuel companies. Many of them probably are parents and of students here at MIT. The other point that we would like to, in doing divestiture, what we're doing is essentially saying that casting all of the fossil fuel industry with broad brush and essentially saying they are producing a product that has these environmental bads that are so terrible that we should divest them and throw them into the same basket as the apartheid in South Africa. I think the second point there is the fact that there, as we said, there are many responsible people to paint the fossil fuel industry with a broad brush is ignoring the many nuances that Brad mentioned in his comment about differences in how the industry operates and the things that they want to do. The other is I think we need to be credible in the response that we take, and it really, I think, from our perspective at least, I think it lacks credibility to say, don't invest in something that essentially you consume and that you are a major contributor to the profitability of. If you really want to take action, if MIT really wanted to take action and to really show an example to Harvard, what it would instead do is implement a carbon price, implement some policies to significantly reduce its carbon footprint. That actually has costs. That actually is going to move forward the debate in terms of implementing a climate policy. That would be real rather than symbolic action that would have a meaningful impact moving forward, rather than dividing people into those that produce fossil fuels when there are many, as Brad said, different gradations of fossil fuels and the benefits that we get. And the final point is just, let's focus on MIT and other universities taking actions in areas where they actually have expertise, and that is in teaching and research and producing students that have a more nuanced view that can go out in the world. The important thing about teaching is that you teach someone, they go out and teach someone else. And so to the extent, and they go out and teach someone else as well. And so to the extent that we create an informed population of students, we are going to have multiplier effects in terms of the sorts of things that we are likely to get implemented in terms of the policies.
My last 7 seconds is engaged shareholders are not the enemy. Apathy and investors sitting on their hands are the enemy.
Thank you. This comes to the conclusion of the debate. Before I thank all of the panelists, who I think have done a great job, I just want to summarize a couple of thoughts that emerge from all of this and some of the work that I've done over the last several years. In 2007, 12 college and university presidents got together and said the climate crisis is so serious that we commit to coming up with a publicly accountable and transparent action plan to become carbon neutral in our operations as a means of demonstrating to the rest of society what needs to be done and that we should do it. And today, there are 697 colleges and universities representing 35% of the student population that have made that commitment. None of them knew that they could actually become carbon neutral, but they decided that they needed to do what was scientifically necessary because they believed in the impact of the climate crisis. In the first 6 years, despite the economy that we've had, the 697 colleges and universities reduced their collective greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, and several are already become carbon neutral, and some will be carbon neutral in the next 2 or 3 years. Now, this is not easy, but basically the presidents of those colleges and universities said that if we do not act, who will? What institution in society has the long-term focus? We do. We were designed to do that as part of higher education. And what was really interesting is that they weren't looking at the investments. It was like a lead wall between what the schools were teaching and how they were operating and how they were trying to demonstrate and engage the students in all kinds of wonderful behavior to reduce the footprint, to make the campuses more pedestrian friendly, get more locally grown, sustainably grown agriculture, and a whole variety of actions that would help the students learn just not in the classroom, but actually behave differently, engaging as a complete community. The fossil fuel divestment movement actually opened the door to have a discussion about what colleges and universities are doing with their investments. I recently started the Intentional Endowments Network for the simple reason that I believe that if higher education is going to be a leader, that it needs to look at where it's investing its money from a positive standpoint. And we should be using environmental, social, and governance criteria in determining which entities we are going to invest in. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you will divest of fossil fuels or do it overnight, but you will be making a conscientious decision about where you're putting your money that supports your goals and the ability to get the money that you need, but also is moving society in a more healthy, just, and sustainable path. So I think that the piece of advice that I have for MIT is twofold. One is to be more comprehensive, and I know that's what you're trying to do with the climate conversation, is to have a really good climate action plan and a sustainability plan, not just for the university, but one that moves society in a more healthy, just, and sustainable path. And to leave the investments out, whether you decide to divest of fossil fuel, to not employ environmental, social, and governance criteria means that you think that the only thing of importance is what you teach and how you operate but not what you do with the financial investment in trying to move industry in a more positive direction. So I want to, this is now time for the audience to hoot and cheer and thank these wonderful panelists. In the lobby will be wonderful refreshments, and you will have a chance to talk with the speakers.